again, guys.
The panel at 4:15. Oh my Lord. Today, what we've heard today. And so we're wrapping up what we've learned today, what we've heard today on the private finance side. But if the eagle-eyed among you would have noticed that there is a key stakeholder group missing from both of those panels, and it falls between the cracks. And I would like, just before we start, and I'm hoping we've got Douglas online and he'll come on after this, but I just want to play you a video. I'm doing it without permission, but it's on YouTube. So I hope it's okay. It's from a young woman who represents the Indigenous peoples of my home country, New Zealand. Could we play the video, please?
Since the Paris Agreement, we've seen ever more clearly the consequences of global warming. Yet the world has not made anything like enough progress in reducing.
I could claim Nicholas Sturgeon, but no. Can we play it later? I'll go have a look. All right. We'll play it later because I do want you to hear it. But you know, technicalities and that. Okay, well, that gives us more time at least. All right, so we're going to move then from that. Douglas, do we have you online?
Yes, Wendy, I'm very much here.
Amazing. Right. Douglas, we've only got sort of 15 minutes, but before we move to our speakers, did you just want to add anything just by way of sweep up to the day on the private finance? And by private finance, public-private partnership as well, obviously, but on the out of the negotiation side.
Well, from what I'm hearing, albeit not physically present, from what I'm hearing, things are encouraging. And we look forward, as GCF does, we're, from my vantage point, of going forward with the commitments, and we are in the middle. As I like to put it, we are the bridge between commitment and hope. So we are ready to go ahead with whatever contributions there are, and as we have been doing, making sure that these funds reach the developing countries in as quick as and as rapid a manner as possible. And we're making good progress on that, and we'll continue to do so. As my executive director said when we were coming to COP, we had exhausted the last round of, I think, $1 billion a quarter. And he said, well, that's good news going to COP. We just tell them we have no money. We have lots of projects to fund, but we have no money. So what I'm hearing thus far is very encouraging. Over.
Very important to bringing the commercial law right into the front line of the finance conversation for climate mitigation and climate adaptation and resilience. It's a very dear friend of mine, Miriam Ormy, who is the head of sustainability at LGIM, one of the largest asset managers, universal owners in the world, over $1 trillion under management. And Meryam is also a high-level climate finance champion. She's been working with the UNFCCC Race to Zero. And Meryam was very much involved in and collectively responsible for many of those pledges that are we back? That were amalgamated under the GFANZ, the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero. But she also was the person who pushed me to put the talk into action on the Net Zero Lawyers Alliance. So Meryam, as lawyers, we thank you. As a community, we thank you. But we always come together at the end of Climate Law and Governance Day with an update on the negotiations. But we thought we would bring you in for just a quick quick update on your highlights of the week. Thanks.
Hi. So in terms of the commitments that came out of the financial institution, we've been working on this for over a year and a half. The big number was 130 trillion. It literally doesn't mean anything. It's too big for any of us to really comprehend it. But if I might just bring this down to what it really means. First of all, we had a situation where everybody's claiming to be net zero, and that wasn't really helpful. So we needed to make sure that we have the sort of the same rules of engagement when people are claiming to be net zero. And financial institutions are so indirect in terms of the impact on actual GHG, like how do we put the right methodologies in place? So it started with the asset owners who are, pension schemes, sovereign wealth funds, retail funds, and so forth. They need to decarbonize their portfolio at the rate that's equivalent, that's a sort of fair share of halving emissions by 2030. There are different ways of doing that depending on what you're invested in. So there are a lot of tools being developed for asset owners. So if you have a pension and it's not aligned to net zero, please call up your provider and say, I'm sorry, where's my net zero option? Because that's what they should be doing. Then also banks, that banks could be helping companies in terms of their lending activities or advice or, there's so many touch points that the banks have. They are looking at decarbonization through the sectorial pathway. So they are going through all the different sectoral transitions that are happening of their clients, and then sort of saying that we need you to be on this pathway. So they are sort of developing the methodologies, and if that really works, it could be a pivotal shift. And we saw, US companies, Latin American companies coming in to be on that. We also saw asset managers, which is where I work. Asset managers are a little bit like lawyers, and they say, well, we can't do anything unless our clients want us to. So we had to really push the agenda and sort of say, actually, we can create the right environment for clients to want to choose the net zero option. So they have committed a part of the assets to be aligned to be net zero by 2030. So in the case of Legal & General, we made it to be 70% of assets to be aligned to net zero by 2030. There's a little bit of caveat and little footnote there, but I'm not going to go into it. We also saw the insurers. So the insurers could be having investments, which is a sort of asset owner part, but also underwriting. When you get an insurance policy, how does that really align to net zero? Incredibly complicated, but they are committing to developing the methodology and making sure that obviously, if you have the right net zero aligned projects, you get the insurance, but if you don't, you shouldn't be getting some of those insurances. That's where we want to get to. And the very lastly, we saw the service providers, which is probably where it touches on the lawyers a lot more, which is the likes of investment consultants, index providers, rating agencies, auditors. You can argue that a lot of them don't really have the agency to change because they're just providing a service. What we said was, no, you do have agency. You can actually provide the right products. You can provide the right advice. You can provide the right index. And when you're auditing and signing off on company's account, surely you need to understand what net zero means. And if you're auditing a company that's claiming to be net zero, your assurance means that this is doing the right thing in terms of reports. So I think we can go quite far in addressing financial service providers to be net zero. So there's huge amount of work to be done. But what we're saying, we're in the same race, we're in the same tent, developing methodology, going the same direction. It's no longer good enough to, I can't do it because our clients don't ask. It is our responsibility to make sure we know how to do it.
If we had 100 Miriams or even 10 Miriams, imagine what we could do. But we have Alice's, and so who's going to hold the feet to the fire? Alice, tell us.
Thank you, Wendy. So Alice Garton, I run something called the File Foundation. It's a specialist legal re-grantor, which Wendy's told me I have to explain what that means in the foundation world. But we're effectively an intermediary between the big endowed foundations and the NGOs. And we focus on scaling and driving strategic legal action to achieve both the Paris goals and also climate justice. In terms of how I think this applies to private law, the taxonomy that Professor Lavanya Rajamani uses in public law also applies in private law. So we can use private law and commercial law to drive ambition in the net zero plans, for example, which, as Miriam said, 2050 targets are completely pointless. We need 5-year transition plans. You can use company law and advise your clients proactively to achieve those. Accountability is the next one, sort of in the more mundane way. That's cases looking at transparency, disclosures, and whether or not those disclosures are greenwashing. And then in the more important way, accountability for 30 years of delay in action on climate change, which has been caused by disinformation from fossil fuel companies. And then the third one is fairness and equity. And so again, as private lawyers, you can design and build commercial structures which put community ownership at their heart. Or you can look at things like pension funds and the pension funds and fairness between and as between members. And that's where we've seen a really interesting pension case filed just like last week against USS. So I wanted to introduce Ewan. You want to introduce yourself?
Thank you very much, Alice. My name's Ewan McGahey, Reader in Law at King's College London. Could I just have a show of hands? Who here is invested in the university superannuation scheme for their pension? A few hands, and just put your hand up again if you think it's well run. No, okay, we didn't think so either. And so this is a source of big disputes. And so we brought a derivative claim against the directors of the university superannuation scheme, filed last Friday over the valuation and various other things. But we also added in a claim that they should divest from fossil fuels because the chair of the board is ex-coal, British coal, and they don't want to divest, even though Harvard has, even though the biggest fund in Netherlands has ABP. It's got £89 billion at USS. We crowdfunded around £55,000, 1,500 donors. And we're saying that the directors have a duty to divest because fossil fuels cause significant financial detriment to the pension. That's the test approved by the Supreme Court, Lord Carnwath, who was here a bit earlier. Significant financial detriment. And if you're doing that in your investment strategy, you know, fossil fuels have been the worst performing asset class every year since 2017, then you're breaching your duties as a director under the Companies Act section 171. You're using your powers for an improper purpose. And we're also saying that these duties in private law have to be interpreted in line with the right to life under the European Convention. So, you know, that's a similar argument to what the Dutch have done. We say that net zero by 2050, that's USS's current policy, is not enough, but because that means that they plan to do zero now. And so we need to divest straight away and get every single company that they invest in to carbon free. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Alice. Thank you, Ewan. I'm just going to keep going down this side of the table first to finish with Stephen Gray, because he's kind of the next step in the story, the next chapter in the story. So anybody who's watched the TED Talk about how to start a movement, you have a leader and then you have a first follower. And what the Net Zero Lawyers Alliance needed was a first follower. It needed a law firm to pick it up and run with it with courage and with real passion and belief. And Stephen Gray brought DLA Piper in as that first follower law firm. And really, there wouldn't be a Net Zero Lawyers Alliance or a lot of the conversations that you've heard today on the commercial law side without this gentleman to my left. So, Stephen.
Thank you very much, Wendy. Thanks for the invitation of being here for this panel. Hi, everyone. Just to add and building on Miriam's point, lawyers also provide legal assurance. And with the increasing level of pledges and commitments from the financial sector and other corporates, lawyers are now at the heart of documenting the transition in the legal documentation needed to implement deals, transactions, etc. My first job was in a law firm in the late 90s, but I quickly left because I wanted to work on climate. I recently, 2 years ago, joined DLA, and for me that was a quite important moment in terms of just realizing how finally the demand from clients was coming in regards to facilitating and helping with services or climate-related services. So it's a real honor and opportunity to be or having gone all the way round in that way. I've never stopped working on climate, but it's really fulfilling now to be here with all of you and with many other law firms also getting up to speed and trying to service a very important need. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Stephen. Stephen is the embodiment of a multifaceted career which crosses all the silos that we've split into today. Vesselina, anything to add on the day from
Thank you,
the MDB?
Hello. Hi. Yes, I'm on. It's been a fascinating morning, and I'll try to sum it up in a few minutes, but it's a difficult act to follow after Miriam and the other outstanding panelists. So what we heard is that that there needs to be dedicated channeling of public and private finance and partnerships between public and private actors in order to deliver on the Paris Agreement and objectives. I think what we've heard so far is different perspectives, such a rich and insightful discussion. I wanted to add a few points. So we heard today and over the last few days, the multilateral development banks have scaled up their commitment. They've pledged to accelerate making climate finance available in the emerging markets and developing countries. The commitment also to work and mobilize private sector financing, I think, is a fundamental, because public sector alone, public funding alone is not sufficient. So I think it's a very difficult, what in our work we have seen the gulf between the developed frameworks and standards in the global north and the kind of the dearth of information and legal frameworks in the markets where we engage, when we develop. And so I'm very pleased that the MDBs have also committed to enhanced engagement on the policy side, also on the technological side, so that they can make these investments a reality, so they can bring in the know-how and also the technological advances. We've spoken about aligning the financial flows with the Paris Agreement, but what does it mean? I think there is no standard about how to align the financial flows with the mitigation goals or the adaptation. We've seen also the emergence of a global standards and frameworks. One thing I wanted to mention is the a voluntary-led framework for assessing, managing, disclosing climate risks, which is the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosure. And why it's important for the businesses is because what the TCFD is trying to achieve is contributing to having more transparency and data, because climate risk is also a very systemic financial risk. And if the businesses are not aware of the risks, both in terms of physical risks, so the impact that the climate change is having on their assets, on their portfolio, and on the businesses overall, if they don't report, then there will be no information for the public and for the investors. The transition risks are also difficult to measure, but this is really the risks of to the businesses of the impact of the policy and the regulatory reforms that is coming, the net zero commitments, but policymakers, how this will affect individual businesses. And of course, the litigation risk, so we have heard about it. So with this, I just wanted to wrap up and to see that, to say that one of the main also areas of engagements with the clients is to help them in this transition is to work on with them on making this behavioral change, making this systemic impact by bringing in knowledge to assess their risks and to help businesses from the emerging market to be ahead of the game, to be leaders, and to develop new opportunities in this net zero transition, new business opportunities, which I think is essential for making this happen. So with this, I will hand back over to Wendy.
Thank you so much again, Vessi, and for the years of work. So Emily, we cut you off early before. we might do it again, but squeeze in as much as you can that you skipped off last time. No, because Mary Claire gave us an extra 5 for
Thank you very much. Just, I guess, three things for me in terms of just wrapping up what I've heard today. I think the fact that there's just so much work to do, there's a huge amount of capacity building. We've put a lot of pressure on legal firms, on general counsel, on boards of directors, on professional services firms. And so there's a rapid need for us to really be targeted and thoughtful about how do we build capacity within this community that's going to be so important for us to be able to get these things done. Just in the context of the work that we're doing with the Climate Governance Initiative, we're very aware of this with the non-exec directors and the chairs, and we do have plans now in place to rapidly kind of mobilise knowledge and so that they can understand what effective climate governance looks like on boards. But we obviously need to be able to work with many others to kind of drive that. I think it's clear to me, you know, there's a huge movement going on with what net zero transition plans mean for corporates and executives. There's a huge conversation that we're involved in around what that means, what climate governance means for non-execs, a huge kind of push with the lawyers, a huge push for the investors. And I think there's a need for this cross-cutting understanding of what different communities are asking. And in particular, the pace of change over the trend is just phenomenal. And so I think by making sure that each of these communities understand what the kind of pushes are and what the next thing is really important. And then I think the final point, we've talked a lot about this need for short-term transition plans, but it goes back to the capacity building. We're sort of needing to do this in parallel, and it's really tough. And on top of all of that, we also need to make sure that we're building in the need for focus on building climate resilience as well. We know that there are opportunities, particularly with some of the nature-based solutions, to build that into the net zero transition planning, but really critical that we don't lose sight of that important resilience point. So those would be my 3 key takeaways from today.
That's absolutely brilliant. Thanks, Emily. That's so terrific. And on the capacity building side, a word of encouragement. We've had some folks who've been at this for decades, and one of them has come onto our panel. And those of you who have listened to me today and listened to Mary Claire her entire life know how important we think the voice of the young is. But there's also, you know, people
by contrast,
people who've been working at this for many years have actually gotten us to here. And, you know, we have a chance because of people like James Cameron, and he and Philippe Sands set up SEAL. I attended an event that SEAL was doing today for the Indigenous Peoples platform, yesterday for the Indigenous Peoples platform in the Blue Zone at COP. The video I'm going to play you after James speaks is from a representative of the Indigenous Peoples platform. James, over to you.
Bless you, Wendy. Thank you very much. I have arrived at a certain age too. But listen, I'm very grateful for you for fitting me into your program when I've got competing obligations to go to. And I'm very grateful for you continuing to include me in your community, since I no longer practice law or teach law, although I've got friends who do and people who I've worked with before. And also out of respect to Mary Claire and all the organization that goes into this event. So even though I don't practice law anymore and I don't teach law anymore, at least not for now, you never know, I seem to be gravitating towards the law more in everything else that I do. And it includes a sort of deeper respect, and if it doesn't sound too corny, love for the law, the role of the law, the rule of law, the fundamental fairness that's embedded in the idea of law, the capacity for law to pull the big levers in our society towards the flow of resources, and not just the financial resources, which this panel has correctly turned its attention to, or the human resources, the ingenuity and creativity that we need to solve this highly complex climate change problem, but the institutional capacity to do the transition right, to do it fairly and justly, and to include as many of the solution providers from wherever they come from in the world, whatever age, whatever part of society. That does require law to work to its best ideal, to its will to perfection, to be the best of ourselves and to help us organize our response in ways that are sometimes extremely difficult for the community at large to appreciate. And that requires a certain dedication and attention to detail and concern to be correct in the way things are done, that lawyers at their best do. And that makes them very effective agents of change, should they choose to be. It can make them obstructors as well. It can mean that they use their professional duties in a way that gets in the way of creativity, that makes them too wedded to a business model, that is too interested in billable hours and not enough in finding solutions to problems that affect us all. So I think I'd just like to pick three very obvious areas where I can see the law having a profound impact on our ability to save ourselves from ourselves. So the first is in international law itself, a system gravely in need of our commitment to it, struggling to remain relevant in the face of some rather offensive nationalism and populism that simply cares less about how we organize internationally. And in that context, we've got to get better at how we do multilateralism because it's under threat. And that might mean that we think more creatively about the types of international agreement, the ones that are more likely to be enforced, the ones that get closer to being contractual, the ones that can build trust and confidence that promises are honored. And this week is a very important week to see that because of the big announcements that have been made. And we are naturally thinking, well, it's fantastic, that does move the needle. If implemented, if delivered, where are the delivery mechanisms? Many of them are going to require institutional design, rules, principles, operational guidelines, all that stuff. That's number one. Number two, the commercial law is absolutely vital for organizing the delivery of these resources. You've talked already about supply chains, and I'm not going to go into that one, but the commercial law provides discipline, private contracts that have to be honored, dispute settlement provisions that have to be abided by, places to have arguments rationally. That whole field needs to be energized around the delivery of net zero, and it's going to need competent, capable, curious lawyers to do that. And the third area is really to do with education and the way we teach law. The openness we have to other ways of thinking about law, practicing law, different jurisdictions, the openness to learn from indigenous peoples and their sense of where justice lies and how we organize a response to it. Huge opportunity for those who still, and I honor them, teach law, to open up that space for the kind of creative thinking that we'll need for a new generation, a new cadre of lawyers who will bring that energy, enthusiasm, and frankly, that sometimes that fear that this will not be fixed without their leadership, because the intergenerational equity factor is huge in this debate. That space for creativity really needs to be focused on, and I think I'll leave that with you. Thank you very much.
So James, you may want to leave the law, but the law's not going to let you.
No, that's true. Thanks very much.
Thank heavens for James. So we're going to leave the closing word now to India, if we may. It'll be worth the wait.
Hello everyone. Pokahiraniki Timanga Kutuki Te Awa, Kongaruru Te Awa, Kutusakuri Te Awa, Kongat Community Iwi Tihe Muriora, Ko India Middle Loganariako. My name is India, and I am from a nation called Kongat Community on the east coast of the North Island of Aotearoa, colonially known as New Zealand. In February of last year, catastrophic climate change-filled wildfires tore their way across Eastern Australia. The smoke cloud was so big that the sun turned red in my own homelands, far from the east coast of Australia. At that time, I was supporting my younger brother in hospital, and the doctors told us that they were seeing higher amounts of people with breathing issues related to the smoke in the air. In that moment, our health was bound to the struggle of the land and people in another country. In the impacts of climate change, our fates are intertwined, as are the historic forces that have brought us together today. Before we embark on these 2 weeks of negotiations, it is important to reflect on how we ended up in this room, with thousands of other people masked up and poised to deliberate. And to do this, I must go back hundreds of years into the roots of imperialist expansion and the story of my own community. 252 years ago, invading forces sent by the ancestors of this presidency arrived in my ancestors' territories, heralding an age of violence and murder and destruction enabled by documents like the Doctrine of Discovery that were formulated in Europe. Land in my region was stolen by the British Crown in order to extract oil and suck the land of all its nutrients, while seeking to displace my people and end our practices. The first time I personally experienced these violent processes was at 10 years old, when the local council attempted to steal our community's land for the construction of a highway. And then after that, the New Zealand government stole the foreshore and seabed and offered it up for deep sea oil drilling the following year. These historic forces continue to shape my life and have brought me here. I have grown up in these negotiations, spending my 20s running through these halls, lobbying decision makers and staying up far past midnight hand-stitching banners. Since my first climate talks in Paris, I've been giving the same speech. I've been applauded and awarded for conjuring emotive imagery of rising sea levels and yearly wildfires that my community continues to endure. 6 years ago, I first spoke these stories into this space, and every year since, I've repeated the same words: wildfires, sea level rise, wildfires, suffering, sea level rise, biodiversity loss, sea level rise. Emissions continue to rise. I'm the same age as these negotiations. I've grown up, graduated, fallen in love, fallen out of love, stopped and changed a couple of careers along the way, all while the global north, colonial governments and corporations fudge with the future. And as Indigenous, knowing that this history shows us that hands and minds made this present world, and so it is also hands and hearts and minds that can remake it. And it is Indigenous and frontline communities that are leading this remaking. We're keeping fossil fuels on the ground and stopping fossil fuel expansion. We're halting infrastructure that would increase emissions and saying no to false solutions. In fact, in the US and Canada alone, Indigenous resistance has stopped or delayed greenhouse gas pollution equivalent to at least 1/4 of annual emissions. What we do works. In the face of mediocre leadership, Indigenous peoples shine through. This is all to say that climate change is the final outcome of the colonial project. And in our response, we must be decolonial, rooted in justice and care for communities like mine who have borne the burden of the global north greed for far too long. I cannot put it more simply than that we know what we are doing. And if you aren't willing to back us or let us lead, then you're complicit in the death and destruction that is happening across the globe. Rights frameworks must be entrenched in the Paris rulebook. Finance must be redistributed from the likes of war games in the Pacific towards loss and damage and a just transition. And richer countries have to commit to steep emissions reductions this decade, rather than palming off responsibility through carbon markets. And last but not least, land back, oceans back. This is all part of following Indigenous leadership. This is what keeping warming below 1.5 degrees looks like. This is an invitation to you. This COP, learn our histories, listen to our stories, honor our knowledge, and get in line or get out of the way. Kia ora. Thank you.